Hello and welcome. I am Exolite, and this is my channel. Before we begin, please remember to click that thumbs up button. If you're not already, please subscribe. Fuchten, a vampire story. To those it may concern, if you are reading this, then I can only assume that he has found me, and I have been taken away into the darkness that surrounds him, and have gone back to the earth and ash from whence I came, or am one of them. In this letter I am praying that you will see and recognize that I am not crazy, nor deranged, nor am I merely a child with an overactive imagination. I swear this to you. I am nearly the last one of my village, and I refuse to leave my family alone, lying cold under a pile of earth, with nary a marker to give them a name for those who find this place. This is my story of those who unknowingly lived in the path of an evil so great that one cannot describe it for fear they may go insane, even me, at the age I am, yet having matured much past my years on this earth. I know this monster as intimately and as well as any human can, and what I'm about to tell you comes not from ancient lore nor wives' tales. This is the true story of the figure known to me as Alcott. That is his name. You will find no beginning, nor middle, nor end. He is simply Alcott. While I describe him as a monster, and believe me when I say that he is something sent straight from hell, do not think that you will see him coming. Do not think that you will say to yourself when you see him, "This is a monster," because he is at once the most beautiful being you will ever see, and also, hidden deep from view, the most vile, contemptible abomination to our Lord God. My village became acquainted with Alcott during the great famine. So many died. So many around us that my mother and father took to praying for souls every night and morn before every meal, and as they tucked us, their children, into bed. There was what seemed to me, even as I was a child of only 7 at the time, a sense of terror in our village. Yes, we were barely surviving on the meager offerings of food. True that the sick were the first to go, and all so hard as that was to see, I could also tell that there was a collective sigh as the old ones passed. I knew then that it was most certainly because that meant that there was one less mouth to feed. Even as women and infants died in childbirth, I'd see the men look to the heavens as they crossed themselves, as if to ask God to forgive them for their selfish thinking. When Alcott came walking into our village, he was looking unwell, pale, his hands shaking, his body frail, and I saw the dread in the eyes of the villagers. They were not afraid of Alcott, although they should have been, but were yet still unaware of the horrors that walk the earth, coming straight from the imagination of Satan himself. No. They were afraid of a stranger robbing them, or even a new mouth to feed. The village came together for one meal per day. Supper was the time where everyone brought what little had been killed on a hunting expedition, or fished from the streams, or caught gnawing away into a bag of dried wheat. It did not matter where the meat came from, and we shared it along with potatoes and root vegetables that last for several months in a dry cellar. wheat ground into flour and made into bread, chickens, eggs, and if we were lucky, the fruit from some fruit-bearing trees. Some had the worms inside, and were removed, for there was little to feed us, said my grandmother. Let the worms look after themselves. Alcott did not eat more than a mouthful of food, but still he began to look well, healthy, and strong. But sometime, and I remember the event as if it were yesterday, we began to eat our supper while the sun was still high in the sky. Crosses had been drawn hastily from blood, and they marked the doors to the homes of our neighbors and ourselves. The men would whisper, and the women would gather to clean the cloths and speak so quietly that one couldn't hear them unless they stood nearly on their feet. The darkness. My father called this feeling of dread, this weight of fear that settled into your soul as if it were smoke caught in a chimney. Fürchten. It had begun one evening. The night was clear and the stars shone brightly. A warm breeze was blowing as we let the door stay open to clean out the winter air and bring in the newness of spring and hope. The silence was broken by a scream, a truly horrifying scream, a guttural feeling of terror. The village lit up with torches as the men met on the road. There was another cry from a woman, Mrs. Hansen. "Where is she? Where is she, my Ida?" As Mr. Hansen came running out with an axe. "Have you not seen her? She was fetching water. Look by the well," he yelled as the men charged over towards the well, and Mrs. Hansen went as well, even as the women tried to hold her back. Then another scream, one I can't ever get out of my mind. The low belly sound of an injured animal pierced the night as Mr. Hansen became frantic, picking up his daughter, and as the torchlights fell on her, I could see, even as a child, that she had been torn to pieces, her head barely held by strips of flesh, the blood dripping from her neck, over her shoulders, and down her arm, making tiny splashes in the dirt. Alcott took her from her father, who was buckling under the weight of his terrifying discovery. "Was it an animal or a human?" came the cries. "What would do this?" The moonlight lit the face of Alcott, as everyone else was turning their heads in horror. I saw his face, his pristine and beautiful face, his cheeks plump and pink, the veins in his arms throbbing, the corner of his mouth, there, the tiniest speck of red, as he dragged his tongue over the corner of his lip, and his eyes glowing. Was that the red and orange dancing in his eyes from the torches? Or were his eyes dancing in red and orange? I quickly looked away. The next day the crosses went up onto the doorways as the men dug the grave, the first of many, for people who died not from starvation, but from their throats being torn from their necks, leaving an empty body, limp, the eyes wide open, as if still seeing something so utterly terrifying that even in death they could not close. Over the next 22 months the deaths came. Alcott had become a trusted member of our village. He was bestowed the honor of saying the prayer over the dead bodies. But I'd seen Alcott that night, and on a few occasions since, caught that something in his eyes, him looking at me, through me. I felt as though he could feel my fear, my judgment, my curiosity. Also, at the same time, the crops grew, and the deer and the rabbits and the birds would come around to sneak their portion of the food. The village became prosperous with food once again. Babies were born, even as the oldest and sometimes the strongest males would be heard their screams piercing the night, some seemingly taken from their own beds. The stories began to be told. The fear of demons began to rise. The town prayed and built a church to present to Alcott. He relished in his place, his new position in town, adored by many, even when the Fuchston had lingered like a fog that rolls in and never leaves. Even in celebrations, one body could never fully unroll for the fear of the next scream puncturing through our chests, straight into our hearts and minds, was always just under the surface. Also, in that same time, the crops grew, and the deer and the rabbits and the birds would come round to sneak their portion of the food. The village became prosperous with food once again. Babies were born, even as the oldest and sometimes the strongest males would be heard their screams piercing the night, some seemingly taken from their own beds. The stories began to be told. The fear of demons began to rise. The town prayed and built a church to present to Alcott. He relished in his role, adored by many, even when the Fuchston had lingered like a fog that rolls in and never leaves. In celebration, one's body could never fully uncurl for the fear of the next scream puncturing through our chests straight into our hearts and minds was always just under the surface. Once, my father, in the privacy of our own home, whispered that he feared that it may be Alcott who brought this darkness upon us, or even Alcott himself. For only he among us never seemed to come down with an illness, or bear the leathery lines on men's faces who work in the sunlight. In fact, Alcott remained ensconced in his church during most hours of the day and night. Although he did participate in celebrations, my father said that he had taken note that Alcott drank only of the wine, and maybe a mouthful of the bread. My mother harshly hushed him, scolded him for thinking such thoughts, and said that they must never be spoken out loud in her home again, lest the gossiper bring ill will upon their home. To those that this may concern, within days of those whispers, my village was ravaged. Men, women, and child. Each night 1, 2, maybe 3 horrifying screams of terror, and the brutal ends to which they had succumbed was getting much worse, if that was even possible. Limbs were torn from their bodies, entrails pulled from their stomach, and one such night as I watched my father light his lamp to go check on our sheep, as they would not calm, they cried out into the night as if they knew there was a dark force among us. I went with my father to the door. My mother, by now, having deep, sunken eyes, her once beautiful face was now gaunt and stamped with what can only be called terror, begged him to stay inside. He took an axe with him, I promised to stand in the doorway, and as I did, I watched my father walk slowly, cautiously out into the pitch-black night when suddenly I saw a figure come between my father and the moon's light, and I heard my father's wretched cries. And that's when I saw. As I stood in the darkened doorway, a being looked up as if it had the feeling of being watched, or maybe smelled me. And as it turned and tilted its head, I saw them. The fiery orange and red eyes. Those eyes that I knew belonged to Alcott. It is dark now. 3 weeks have passed, and I alone, along with Alcott, who has been inside the church all day, are the sole survivors. But I fear that I am next. Thank you for coming to my channel, and as a reminder, if you enjoyed this story, please give it a thumbs up. If you would like to be subscribed to my channel, please click that subscribe button. And if you'd like to be notified when my content goes live, go ahead and click that bell, and notice that there will be 3 options somewhere on your screen. 1 to be notified every time there's content, 1 to be notified occasionally, and 1 to be notified rarely. Please make sure that you click until you get the one you prefer. Good night.